let me introduce to you Joshua Ramo now, who himself will introduce our next session also. Joshua is a global thinker, I would really say. He has been the youngest editor of Time magazine. When was that, actually? Not to be unpolite, in the 90s. And you are now the managing director of Kissinger Associates. What is Kissinger Associates, actually?
We're the strategic advisory firm chaired by Dr. Henry Kissinger, a good friend of Dr. Burtis.
Yeah. And you advise companies to come to China a lot, but also international relations, yes? That's correct. That's why you follow, basically, Henry Kissinger and his shuttle diplomacy flying all over. Actually, you wrote an article 3 years or 5 years ago, what is your personal speed in life?
Yeah, we had this challenge, which I think is probably common to many people here, which is how you compare which of us is traveling the most. So we came up with this metric, Joichi Ito and I, who's also a DLD aficionado, which was we took the total number of miles we had flown in the year and divided it by the number of hours in the year to get our personal velocity. So last year my personal velocity was about 47 miles an hour. At any given moment, that's how fast I was likely to be going.
Okay, so Joshua was at every given moment at 47 miles an hour. That's very interesting to calculate what is your personal speed. And in this article you wrote about what does it mean to your life, actually, your speed, your life. Recently you wrote a book. The book, to quote it correctly, is called The Age of the Unthinkable. And in this book you look at this world today from your high velocity, very global viewpoint, working for a long time in international global relations. And this book is a success. It's a New York Times bestseller. And so we're really happy that you give us some of your ideas in this book. But let me say, Joshua is not only a left-brainer. I also learned you're a competitive aeronautic pilot. So I think maybe you need these two abilities today if you're high in the air. And so I think this is really a very full personality. Now the stage is to yours, and we're looking forward to this next session because it's extending to a ground session at DLD. Okay?
Thank you very much. One of the great pleasures of working for Dr. Kissinger, of course, is that you're working for somebody who is very much a historian. And I recall a couple of years ago sitting with him in his office in New York, and we were sort of talking about the state of the world. And I said to him, do you ever remember a period really in human history that looks so much like this period, where the world seemed to be shifting and changing so dramatically all at once? And Henry sort of sat there and he thought for a minute, sort of a very quiet afternoon in Manhattan, and finally after a while he turned to me and he said, not since the collapse of the Roman Empire. Dr. Kissinger, of course, not known for his great optimism. But we are clearly living at a moment of tremendous change. And what's so exciting about being in an environment like this is the sort of disruptive change that we see underway in technology. In media, of course, is only a marker of the disruptive change that's occurring everywhere in our world. We're living today really very much in what I call the age of the unthinkable. And by that I mean a couple of things. The first is that all you have to do is pick up the newspaper to find things that a year ago would have been unthinkable happening all around you. The idea that the U.S. economy could be shedding, for instance, 600,000 jobs a month, that financial losses could occur as quickly as they have, that companies like Google would find themselves in confrontations with the largest governments in the world. So all around us is evidence of things that people in this room who think about technology will take for granted, that ideas that seem impossible become possible and radically transform the shape of our world. But by the age of the unthinkable, I also mean something else. And that's that the best minds, the people we rely on to think about this world, understand the world, to lead us out of trouble, today, as often as not, deliver solutions which not only fail, but which backfire. The most expensive war against terrorism in human history produces, at the end of the day, more dangerous terrorists. Trying to make the world better off by spreading capitalism around the world drives the gap between rich and poor wider than it's ever been in human history. In these and in a long list of areas, the policies we pursue and the results that we get are often the exact opposite of what we intend. And so what's truly unthinkable today is that we're using a set of ideas, a set of notions that were really drawn from hundreds of years of international affairs thinking to be applied to a world where they're simply not relevant. That takes us almost immediately out of the context of what's going on in this room and into the larger discussion of what's happening in the world. One of the things I tried to understand in my book was, what can we learn from the people who are succeeding today? We're very clearly living in a revolutionary age, and one of the markers of a revolutionary age, of course, is it takes the great figures of the old age, whether they're people like Alan Greenspan or now we're seeing Ben Bernanke, and very quickly discredits their reputations, right? This happens to the czars during the Russian Revolution. It's the mark of a truly revolutionary period in history. But what's exciting about revolutionary periods, of course, is that they have the ability to elevate people from positions of great obscurity into positions of tremendous importance, whether those are caves in Pakistan or places like the Illinois State Senate. Revolutionary moments offer the possibility for tremendous reinvention. And the kinds of disruption that we see in the world today produces that. Disruption in our future is inevitable. And this is an audience that very much understands that in technology terms. But it's true in international affairs terms as well. One of the groups I spent a lot of time with for my book was Hezbollah. I first got to know Hezbollah about a decade ago when I was the foreign editor at Time magazine. And when you spend time with Hezbollah, one of the things that strikes you almost immediately is the similarity of their outlook, their viewpoint, their way of behaving to all of our friends who work at places like Google and Facebook. These are people who believe that disruption is an inevitable part of our future, that disruption is in their interests, and they want to do everything they can to encourage disruption. And that's as true for Google, that's trying to disrupt information content, as it is for Hezbollah, that's trying to disrupt the politics of a place like Lebanon. We're in a race today, and it's a race between disruption for good and disruption for bad. And that leads to a couple of things that are relevant for the session we're about to turn to next and that I have the pleasure of introducing. The first is there's a relationship between the way technology works and the way all of this other disruption works. You know, when I first moved to China about 8 years ago, one of the things you see as a foreigner when you begin speaking Chinese to Chinese people is their first reaction is just astonishment that a foreigner is speaking Chinese to them. They sort of react as if a dog is talking to them, which means for the first 5 minutes of their conversation, they're kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe that dog is talking to me, before they actually begin to absorb the content of what's being said. Oftentimes, when you put technology people in a room with foreign policy people, you get a very similar reaction. It's very hard to think in terms of constant disruption and the need for ceaseless innovation when you're used to thinking in foreign policy terms where you think in a much slower time cycle. We're about to have the pleasure of being entertained and informed by a single family that has crossed this gap. The Ahtisaari family, Martti and Marko. Martti, all of you will know not only as the former president of Finland and also as a Nobel Prize winner, but as somebody who worked tirelessly over the years to bring peace into some of the most difficult parts of the world. And not simply to bring peace into those parts of the world, but to do so successfully. When we talk about paradoxes today, one of the interesting paradoxes is that often the harder we try to make peace in a place like the Middle East, the more attention we pay to a place like Afghanistan, the more unstable and disruptive they become. The very act of paying attention disrupts the environment. And so we'll have with us this afternoon somebody who's not only managed to pay attention in various places, but to actually be successful. And we'll also be joined by Marko, who, in addition to having a background as a composer and as a global thinker, possesses that intuitive sense of technology that's now led him to become the chief designer at Nokia. They'll talk in some detail about the fundamental questions that we're talking about, which is, what's the relationship between what we learn about disruption when we think as technologists and what we should know about disruption as we think about the world from foreign policy terms? But I think the most important thing they'll do is that they'll elevate us briefly out of this room and into the world around us. We're living in a historic period. And people say the difference between a historic period and an ordinary period is in an ordinary period you can kind of go through your life and you're not really affected by the grand currents of history. That's really not the age we're living in. We're living in one of these ages like 1929 and the decade and 2 decades that follows it, when history will come and touch every one of our lives. And that creates in each of us a tremendous obligation. It creates us an obligation to use what we know how to do in this room, this habit of innovation, this habit of interconnectedness, to actually make the world a better place. Because if we are in a race between disruption for good and disruption for bad, if we accept that disruption is inevitable, that then creates in each of us the obligation of people living in a historic moment, which is to ask ourselves every single day, what is my responsibility? The world is changing dramatically. What does this demand of me? And so with that, let me give you 2 people who have very successfully asked and answered this question. Marco.